At the edge of dawn, when the world was still the color of bruised lilac and chimney smoke, she arrived in Arundel, clinging to the back of a slow, manure-smeared cart that had carried her across miles of frostbitten countryside. The road had been long and mostly silent, except for the occasional clatter of wheels over stone and the quiet whimper of the child in her arms, a sound so soft it felt like breath trembling against bone. She had wrapped the baby in her best wool, threadbare but clean, and tucked the little feet into the fold of her own dress to keep them warm, though her legs were stiff from holding still for hours. The city rose before her like a story too grand to belong to someone like her, all domes and iron-gilded balconies, with bells tolling from cathedral towers that caught the morning light like teeth. Her name was Morel, though she had not spoken aloud in days. Names, she had begun to believe, were luxuries, like sugar and tea or a second pair of shoes. And her voice, when she used it now, came out thin and grainy from disuse. Her daughter's name was Leora. She had whispered it into the child's hair 1,000 times during the long nights they had spent together on borrowed cots and in half-abandoned barns. The syllables her only thread of warmth. Leora meant light, in the tongue her grandmother used to speak before illness took her memory, and Morel had clung to that meaning with a kind of wild hope, as if naming her child after something luminous might somehow keep her from drowning in the dark. The city smelled of horse sweat and rose water, of the river's brackish edge and the coal soot that drifted from chimneys like bitter confetti. Morel stepped down from the cart with one hand, cradling Leora, and the other gripping the splintered rail for balance. Her boots touched cobblestone with a jolt that shot up through her knees and into her chest. She took a breath and tasted salt, rot, and something sweet, maybe honey, maybe decay. It was impossible to tell in Arundel where wealth ended and sorrow began. The merchant halls gleamed with glass and polished wood, but their shadows were long, and the alleyways between them held things that looked like children but had long ago stopped weeping. The Foundling Registry stood on the eastern edge of the city's court district, beneath the high cloisters of St. Braith's orphan house. It was an ancient building, older than the palace itself, built from marble that had yellowed at the corners and gone soft with lichen. The entrance was framed by columns etched with faded scripture, and behind the heavy oak doors waited a scribe with a ledger as thick as a burial stone. Morel had rehearsed the moment over and over in her mind during the weeks leading to this one. She had imagined arriving proud but silent, like the women in stories who did what they must and did not look back. But now, standing before that door with Leora curled like a nestling against her chest, Morel's spine felt water-soft and her fingers trembled against the swaddling cloth. She knocked once, and then again, harder. A nun answered, her face framed in white linen, eyes sharp as broken pottery. She did not speak, only gesture for Morel to enter and wait. Inside, the room smelled of ink and wet wool, and the air was thick with the sounds of scratching quills and the soft shuffle of slippered feet. The scribe behind the desk was an old man with blue-stained fingers and a cleric's seal stitched into his collar. He looked at Morel, then at the child in her arms, and without asking her name or story, reached for the great ledger with a kind of weary precision. Morel had brought nothing but the child and the scrap of cloth on which he had stitched the baby's birth date, name, and the faint outline of a son, the last remaining thread from the wedding dress her mother had worn. She handed it to the scribe, and for a moment he looked at it longer than she expected. Then he dipped his quill and began to write, each stroke loud in the silence. Full name of the child, he said without looking up. Leora, Morel answered, her voice hoarse. Leora Emmeline. Mother? She hesitated. Morel of Hallow Ridge. My husband's name was... Her throat caught. It was Thane. The man nodded, though she knew none of this mattered. The Foundling Registry did not archive husbands or histories, only relinquishments. His quill moved with bureaucratic certainty, and when he finished, he turned the book to her and pointed. Here, sign. The space waited, blank and wide, as a field of snow. She had not held a quill in weeks, maybe months, and her fingers, cold from the ride and stung by wind, struggled to grip it. When the ink finally touched the page, her name came out crooked and trembling. The last letter unraveled like a thread caught in wind. A nursemaid stepped forward then, younger than Morel, her apron spotless, arms open like a cradle. She said nothing, but her eyes flicked toward the child, and that was the moment the moment Morel had rehearsed and feared and tried to numb herself against. She did not want to let go. Her body refused. Every part of her clenched against the impulse, a visceral tightening, as if surrendering the child might collapse her lungs. Leora stirred in her arms, tiny fists rising to touch Morel's collar, as if sensing the rupture. Morel lowered her head, pressed her lips to the down soft scalp, and closed her eyes. She murmured something then. Not even words, just sound, the way a storm moans before it breaks. When she pulled away, she did it in pieces. First her arms released, then her shoulders, and finally her heart, which did not release so much as splinter. The nursemaid stepped back with the child, and the scribe handed Morel a slip of parchment stamped with the seal of the registry. It was official now. The child was no longer hers. Or perhaps she had never truly been, not in a world where hunger could steal what love tried to hold. She walked out slower than she had entered. The sunlight had risen, painting the street in gold and grays, but the warmth did not reach her. Her hands were empty, and her chest felt hollowed, carved out by grief too large to name. She folded the stamped receipt and placed it inside the seam of her bodice, next to her skin, where it burned like guilt. Behind her, the great oak doors of the registry shut with a sound that echoed off the stone walls, a sound that followed her all the way down the avenue and into the alleys where the world no longer recognized her as a mother. At the edge of the city, she sat beneath an ash tree whose limbs bent toward the earth like arms reaching for what they could not save. Around her, the city went on as it always had. Traders shouting prices, children laughing in doorways, carriages rumbling like distant thunder. She was just one more figure folded into the great, faceless mass. No one stopped. No one asked her name. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of Leora against her breast, could still smell the milk-sweet breath and hear the faint rhythm of a heartbeat not her own. That memory would not fade. It would anchor her through the days ahead, through hunger and frost and silence. It would remind her that once she had held something brighter than hope. And then she stood, because there was nothing else to do, and turned back toward the slums that bordered the river, where the tannery smoke rose in thick black plumes and the air smelled of lye and wet leather. Her child was gone, and yet everything in her still pulsed with the need to keep going, to make meaning out of the absence. The world had taken, but it had not ended. Not yet. She would live because someone had to remember. Someone had to carry the name. The room she rented was barely more than a crawl space beneath a slanted roof, its one window warped with years and cracked in the corner, letting in a breath of wind that never truly slept. It sat above the tannery on Shoemaker's Row, a street steeped in a permanent stink of cured hides and stagnant canal water, where even the brick walls wept with moisture in the early morning hours. The stairs to the attic groaned under her weight, the banisters smooth with the touch of too many hands that had risen and fallen before her. Morel slept beneath the beams on a straw-stuffed mattress that rustled when she turned, the stuffing thin in the middle and sour with old sweat. There was no hearth, only a chipped ceramic base in the corner, and a hook from which she hung her one spare gown, still damp from washing in cold water that stung her fingers raw. Each morning began before light, before the market bell rang, or the crows began their shrill gossip on the rooftop gutters. She rose in silence, folding her hands once over her chest as if in prayer, though no words came. Prayer had turned to a kind of quiet pact. If the world would not offer her mercy, then she would simply survive without it. Her fingers were already stiff by then, knuckles split where the wind had gotten in, nails stained from the tannin powder that clung to the tools and seeped into the walls. She dressed quickly, in layers patched from old things, an apron too large, boots a size too small, everything soaked in the smell of smoke and salted leather. By the time the street began to stir, she was already downstairs, seated on a wooden stool behind the back workroom where the men spoke little and the women less. Her work was stitching harnesses, mostly, and occasionally buckles for farm carts or military rigs. The men did the cutting and boiling and tanning. The women did what was quieter, repair, binding, finishing touches that required small hands and patience. Morel worked with a kind of cold resolve, her back hunched and her face near the lamplight, threading needle after needle with wax cord that bit against her skin. It was not difficult work, but it was unending. The stitches had to be even and the holes punched just so, and there was no room for thought beyond the motion. Still, thoughts found her. Always. They came like the scent of ash after rain, uninvited but everywhere. She tried not to think of Leora while her hands were full, but the child's image lived in the seams between one stitch and the next, appearing in the curl of worn leather that reminded her of a newborn's ear or the sound of a distant wail that slipped through the street noise and made her heart hitch. She imagined her daughter in clean linens now, behind the high windows of St. Braith's, where the babies were kept in cradles carved from alderwood and fed on warm milk by women with soft voices. That was what they told her, at least that the foundlings were cared for. But Morel knew how many truths were wrapped in kindness, like spoiled meat in a sweet crust. She remembered the other women in the workroom who had given up children. Too, the way their eyes would glaze over when someone cried nearby, or how they rubbed at their empty arms during lunch breaks as if phantom weight still lingered there. Outside the tannery, the city spun on in all its merciless glory. Trumpets had begun to echo more often now, signaling the coronation season for the young king, who had taken the throne after a decade of regents and unrest. The banners were being raised from window balconies, stitched with the royal falcon crest, and gilded carriages were drawn to the main avenues, while children in ribbon shoes tossed petals from baskets lined with velvet. Morel saw it all in glimpses as she walked to the public pump in the early evenings or past the main square after market close. She never lingered. The king, with all his lineage and light, felt as far from her world as stars from soil. Still, something about the pageantry made her stop sometimes, just for a heartbeat, to imagine a different life, one in which she had not signed that parchment, not let go. On the day of the coronation parade, the tannery was closed by city ordinance, and for once the workroom was silent, its tables covered in cloth and its fires left cold. Morel found herself on the edge of the crowd by the river bridge, where others like her, laborers, beggars, widows, children with soot-blackened cheeks, had gathered not for celebration, but for the faint promise of seeing something beautiful. The bridge swayed under the weight of bodies, and steam from boiled corn vendors mingled with the perfume wafting from the noble quarters. Morel stood at the railing, clutching the straps of her empty satchel, and watched as the king's retinue passed on horseback, surrounded by guards in navy cloaks and gold-buttoned tunics. The king himself rode in the center, young and unsmiling, his face pale and almost gaunt, as if carved from marble and lit from within. He did not wave, did not gesture. He simply looked forward, as though seeing something no one else could, and then she saw her, or thought she did, just beyond the last row of guards, seated in a side wagon where the palace wet nurses sometimes traveled with the younger wards. There was a woman with a bonnet half drawn over her face, and in her lap, a child. The quilt wrapped around the child's legs was unmistakable. Morel knew the stitching. She had sewn it herself in the long weeks of waiting before birth, using scrap cloth dyed in marigold and indigo, patterns her mother once taught her by firelight. It was worn now, the colors faded, but the stitch work was hers, a kind of signature only she would recognize. Her knees nearly gave, the air leaving her lungs with a force that made her lean hard against the stone railing. The woman in the wagon did not look up. The child's face was turned away, but it didn't matter. That was her daughter. She would have known her in a dark room, from the scent alone. The cart disappeared into the gilded gates of the palace gardens, and Morel stood there long after the crowd had thinned, long after the trumpet's echo had vanished from the streets. She returned to her attic that evening and did not light a candle. She simply sat in the dark, listening to the tannery fires being stoked again and the rats scratching between the walls. Her hands were bloody from the day before, one finger raw where the needle had slipped. She did not bandage it. Instead, she lay on the mattress with her hands folded over her chest, staring into the shadowed ceiling beams, whispering her daughter's name like a chant. Leora, 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 as if she could stitch her child back into her arms with the power of memory alone. From that night on, something shifted in her. A quiet defiance began to harden beneath the grief. She began rising earlier, working faster, saving what she could. She traded her few spare coins for scraps of parchment and half-spent quills, teaching herself to write more clearly, carefully. The letters were clumsy at first, ink smudged and edges blurred, but soon she could form her daughter's name in steady lines, spelling it over and over until it felt less like loss and more like presence. The other women watched her differently now, not with pity, but with the wary distance reserved for those who carried her sorrow too openly. She no longer tried to hide it. She wore her grief like a threadbare shawl, visible in every movement, every silence. Her dreams were colder now. She often woke to the sensation of small hands touching her cheek, only to find her own fingers pressed there. But she never spoke of these things. Not to the washerwoman downstairs who sometimes offered her boiled turnips, not to the apprentice who asked her once if she had family. She simply nodded or shook her head or said nothing at all. Silence was safer. Silence did not betray. And still the world moved. The city gates welcomed more noble visitors. The palace bells tolled with the rhythms of feast and council. The tannery paid late, then less. Bread cost more. Salt was harder to find. The little she earned went first to rent, then to a heel of cheese or half-loaf. Hunger returned like a long-lost relative, familiar and unwelcome, and she swallowed it down with the same resolve she had used the day she signed away her child. But some nights, after the streets had gone quiet and even the cats had stilled, she stood by her cracked window and looked toward the cathedral towers that framed the palace beyond. The candlelight from those distant windows flickered like stars caught in glass. Somewhere in one of those chambers, her daughter breathed, warm and fed, and perhaps even happy. That thought did not comfort her. It burned, but it also anchored her. It reminded her that the story was not over, not yet. There was still time. There was still a name. There was still a quilt she had made with her own hands wrapped around the child she had born from her own body. The world had taken much, but it had not taken everything. Not yet. It was late in the third week of Lent when Morel saw her again, not the child's face, but enough to know, enough to bring the trembling back into her knees and leave her fingers shaking for days. The city was beginning its thaw, and the streets ran with rivulets of melted snow and the stench of rot that came with spring's early breath. Market stalls returned to life in patches, some draped in oilcloth, others hung with bundles of dried herbs that swung from strings like little talismans against illness. Morel had gone to the eastern square in search of flour and onions, though she knew she could only afford one and not the other. Her coin was wrapped tightly in the hem of her apron, knotted 3 times, and she touched it often as she walked, not for superstition but for reassurance. Something solid to hold on to, something her own. She kept her eyes down as she moved, as most working women did, not out of fear, but as habit. Looking too long at anything in Arendelle could lead to trouble. One might see a hunger too familiar in a stranger's gaze or recognize a woman who once had more than she now did. But sometimes, even when eyes are lowered, recognition finds you like wind through a crack in the door, silent, invasive, inescapable. She saw the edge of the quilt first, and her breath stopped before her mind could fully register it. The marigold square, faded to a dusty ochre now, was unmistakable. The thread was pulled in one corner, and she remembered that flaw as clearly as she remembered the ache of birth, because her needle had snapped mid-stitch and she'd had to finish it by hand, pricking her thumb in the process. It was slung over the lap of a woman in a long slate-colored gown, the kind worn by midwives and nurse stewards, walking slowly between market booths, inspecting jars of honey with a kind of casual elegance that didn't belong to these streets. And nestled in the woman's arms, swaddled and quiet, was a child, a girl, from the glimpse Morel caught of soft curls just beneath the bonnet rim, her skin the color of warm milk, her little hand curled around the blanket's edge. The nursemaid turned slightly, and for a heartbeat Morel stood frozen in the space between 2 breaths, the crowd flowing around her like water around a stone. She could not see the child's full face. She did not need to. Some knowing bypassed his sight entirely. It rooted itself in the gut, deep and certain. She followed, not out of conscious decision, but because her feet moved and she could not stop them. Her hand still clutched the satchel at her hip. Her shoulders hunched instinctively, and she weaved between carts and customers without drawing attention. The nursemaid moved leisurely, speaking briefly to a honey seller about clover versus chestnut, laughing once, lifting a small pot to the baby's nose as if to share the scent. The child stirred, her hand brushing the nursemaid's collar, and Morel flinched. The sight was too much. It was more than memory. It was theft, as though something sacred had been taken and displayed like a trophy on someone else's shelf. They passed by the herb stand, the scent of lavender and dried nettle pressing into Morel's skin. But even that familiar aroma could not settle the rising ache inside her. She had seen her daughter. She was sure of it, and now, watching her disappear behind the stone colonnade that marked the path toward the upper district, Morel felt herself severed in two, one part desperate to run after them and scream until someone listened, the other terrified of being seen, of being recognized as a woman who had no right to chase what she had once relinquished. She did not follow beyond the boundary of the colonnade that marked the end of the tradespeople's paths, where the city grew pristine and cruel, with its guards in velvet-trimmed armor and the careful pruning of trees that did not bear fruit. Morel stood behind the final merchant stall, just past a crate of bruised apples, and watched the nursemaid's back disappear into the wealth-washed curve of the promenade. Then she turned and walked the other way, not because she wanted to, but because she could not bear what it would mean to keep going. She returned to her attic with the flowers she had not meant to buy, hands numb and heart stammering in a way that frightened her. She sat beside the cracked window until the flower grew warm in her lap, the bag damp from the heat of her thighs. Outside, the sky deepened into a purple dusk, the kind that made shadows sharpen, and the air smelled briefly of rain, even when no rain fell. She thought of the child again, not as a vision or symbol, but as a breathing creature, alive and held by other arms, cared for by other hands. She had not looked unhappy. That was the strangest part. She had not looked abandoned. And this, more than anything, left Morel unraveling. Because wasn't that what she had prayed for? That Leora would be warm and safe and spared the scraping edge of poverty? Hadn't she knelt on cathedral steps with torn palms and begged for this exact future? And yet, seeing it real and soft and utterly unreachable, felt like a punishment crueler than any blow. The days after that were quieter, but not calm. Morel worked without pause, her stitches tighter than before, as though some urgency pressed behind her fingertips. She stopped speaking at the work table, answering questions only with nods or gestures. Her silence, once a sign of grief, had hardened into something else, something that carried an edge, a kind of quiet demand not to be touched. At night, she began collecting scraps again, bits of muslin and twine discarded near the tannery bins, the wax paper used to wrap cured hides. She hoarded them in the corner of her attic room, unsure what she meant to make, but needing to keep her hands busy. One night, she cut a small square from the lining of her only shawl and folded it into a shape that resembled a bird with broken wings. It stayed on the sill for days before the wind carried it away. Morel began walking new paths to market, memorizing routes that might lead her past the nursemaid again. She never saw her. She watched the gates of St. Braith from the shadowed alley of the cobbler's shop, standing between the barrels until guards made her move along. Once, she tried to speak to a kitchen girl who worked in the orphan house, offering a ribbon for any word of a child named Leora. The girl, too young to understand the depths of want behind the question, only shrugged and took the ribbon anyway. That night, Morel burned the name into a scrap of wood with a heated nail and buried it beneath her mattress, as if hiding it would make it hurt less. Weeks passed. The city shifted. Spring bloomed in earnest, bringing the scent of wet stone and wild garlic. The market swelled. The tannery workload doubled as trade resumed with the outer provinces. Morel's fingers blistered, then calloused. Her hair grew thinner. She ate when she could and drank from the communal pump when she dared, and she continued to rise before the bells rang, each morning carrying with it the same dull ache beneath her ribs. She thought often of the nursemaid's easy smile, the way she had cradled the child with one hand and stirred honey with the other. There was something unbearable about how natural it had looked, as if it had always been so, as if Morel herself had never existed in the child's first days. And yet, despite it all, she could not stop herself from hoping in the quiet, bitter way that refuses to die. Hope came not in grand prayers or fierce declarations, but in small things. The moment she found a smooth stone shaped like a heart near the well, the way the sun broke through her window and landed directly on the spot where she kept her folded receipts, the sound of a lullaby drifting from a neighboring window at dusk. She would never again be whole. That was a truth she no longer resisted. But she could still be present, still carry the name, still walk the streets that her daughter breathed beneath. And sometimes that was enough to keep her upright. Morel no longer tried to speak Leora's name aloud. The sound felt too exposed, too raw, but she whispered in her mind, threading it through her thoughts like beads on a string, keeping it close, secret, sacred. And in the deepest place of her heart, beneath the ache and the want and the shame, she began to make something new. Not a plan, not yet, but a vow, that if the day ever came when the child looked into her face again, she would be ready, not wealthy, not clean of sorrow, but ready, whole enough to stand, brave enough to be known, even if only for a single moment. The cold came earlier than it should have. By the second week of harvest end, the rain had turned to sleet, and the stones of Shoemaker's Row, already slick with tannery runoff, began to freeze at nightfall into dark, treacherous glass. Morel's boots, too tight in the toes and cracked at the seams, offered little protection against the creeping damp that seeped into her stockings by dawn. Each morning, as she descended the narrow, splintering stairwell from her attic room, the cold clung to her bones like an old grief, familiar and unwelcome. There was a sharpness in the wind that reminded her of the farm fields she left behind when she was still Morel of Hallow Ridge, before the coughing sickness took Thane and the baby was still only a weight of hope beneath her ribs. The tannery itself grew crueler with the change in season. The vats, which in summer fumed with chemical heat, now steamed only faintly, and the stench of boiled bark, lime, and rotting hide intensified in the closed air of the lower rooms. The men grew more short-tempered, the women more silent. Work became less about craft and more about endurance. Fingers cracked faster in the cold. Tools slipped from numb hands. The pay, already meager, was reduced without notice when the tannery owner announced that his winter shipment of hides from the northern forest had been seized by thieves on the road. He stood on a crate in the main room and spoke without apology, as if his word were law, as if the hardship belonged to everyone but him. Wages would be halved for at least 6 weeks. Morel said nothing. She didn't have the strength to rage anymore. She only listened, head bowed, heart heavy, and did the math in her mind with quiet despair. Half wages meant she could no longer pay the full rent. She had been living on the edge of survival already, stretching her coins with the practiced desperation of the poor, watering her porridge, wearing the same shift for days, reusing thread until it frayed in her fingers. The attic room was already cold enough to turn her breath to mist by morning, but now she would have to choose between rent and food. And the landlord, a sallow man with ink-stained teeth and a fondness for lifting the hems of women's skirts with his eyes, made it clear that he would not wait. He came knocking the following week with his ledger and a sneer, reminding her that kindness was not part of their arrangement. Morel offered him the last of her silver buttons. He laughed and wrote a new sum in red beside her name. Hunger returned in earnest after that, like an old acquaintance slipping through the door uninvited. It was not the sharp kind of hunger that made the belly ache in protest, but the dull, constant kind that gnawed at the spine and dulled the senses. She began skipping meals entirely, telling herself that she had eaten earlier or would eat later. She poured water over stale bread to soften it, boiled onion skins into broth, and chewed mint leaves to trick her mouth into feeling fed. Her body thinned. Her face, once round with youth, became gaunt beneath the cheekbones, and her eyes took on the sunken look of someone living more in memory than in flesh. What little she still owned began to vanish piece by piece. First, when the shawl her mother had woven, traded to a traveling cloth seller for a half sack of coal dust and a cracked oil lamp. Then her sewing scissors, taken by the landlady's son in exchange for 1 month's delay on her rent. The last to go was her wedding shawl, the only piece of clothing from her life with Thane that had survived the crossing from Hallow Ridge. She folded it carefully, running her fingers over fading embroidery one last time before handing it to a rag merchant, who did not care for sentiment and weighed it like any other cloth. In return, she received 3 copper coins and a bar of tallow soap that smelled faintly of rosemary. She did not cry, not even when she was alone later that night. Grief, it seemed, no longer came in tears but in silence, in the way her body folded over the mattress like a question with no answer. One morning, as she walked to the tannery under a sky choked with ash-gray clouds, Morel passed by a baker's stall where a young girl was sweeping flour from the edges of the counter. The scent of warm rye rose into the air like a taunt, and Morel paused, not from desire but from memory. She had once dreamed of teaching Leora to bake, to roll dough between her tiny palms and dust her nose with flour while the oven crackled. That dream returned now, unbidden and cruel, pressing against her ribs until she had to turn away. She did not notice the baker's apprentice watching her, nor the pity in the girl's eyes. Morel did not want pity. Pity could not buy bread. Pity could not warm the bones or soothe the screaming emptiness inside her chest. That night, sleet turned to snow, the first of the season, heavy and wet and clinging to rooftops in clumps that sagged and then collapsed with hollow thuds. The window of her attic let in a steady draft, and the wind howled through the cracks with a voice that sounded too much like mourning. She tried to sleep, wrapping herself in rags and pressing her feet beneath the folds of her skirt. But sleep would not come. Instead, she lay awake and thought of Leora, of the way her fingers had curled instinctively around Morel's thumb in those first days, of the milk-drunk sighs and soft hiccups against her breast. The memory of that warmth haunted her, more so now as her body grew colder by the hour. In the darkest part of the night, she dreamt of her father, not as he'd been at the end, coughing blood into rags and shouting at ghosts, but as he once was when she was a girl, proud and sun-leathered, sharpening scythes beside the barn and telling stories in a low voice that made her believe the world could be tamed if only one worked hard enough. But even in the dream, his eyes were heavy with warning. He reached for her and then vanished into smoke. When she woke, the air in the attic felt thick and still, and she was shivering so badly she could not stand. She thought then of death, not dramatically, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. If this was to be the end, she thought, then let it be gentle, let it come while she was still dreaming of softer things. But her body, stubborn even in its brokenness, refused to let go. And somewhere in the raw quiet of that night, a deeper hunger rose, not for bread, but for meaning, for something that could anchor her to this world, even if her hands were empty. She had given away everything, it seemed, but her name, and even that felt worn to the edges. The next morning, when the snow had crusted over the streets and the sky hung low with unfallen frost, she walked to Cathedral Square with the last of her strength. Her legs ached, her breath steamed. She held in her pocket the stamped parchment from the Foundling Registry, worn soft from being folded and unfolded so many times it had begun to tear at the corners. She climbed the cathedral steps one by one, ignoring the stares of the city's well-dressed parishioners, and stood before the statue of St. Dolorosa, her cracked feet hidden beneath marble robes, her hands open in eternal, silent sorrow. Morel dropped to her knees. She did not pray. She did not plead. She only reached into her pocket, pulled out the parchment, and held it up to the stone saint as if showing to a mother who had never turned her face away. Then she let it fall. The parchment fluttered from her hand like a dead leaf, drifting down the steps, landing awkwardly near cathedral doors, where it caught on a stone crack and shivered in the wind. She watched it for a long time, not because she regretted it, but because it felt like a final breath leaving her body. In that moment, Morel felt completely empty and completely alive. Not alive in the way the city demanded, with purpose and income and titles, but in the way a flame survives a storm by burning low, hidden, stubborn. When she stood again, her knees were stiff, and her breath came in clouds, but something had shifted. She had nothing left to give, and yet something in her refused to vanish. A small, defiant spark still smoldered in the hollow beneath her ribs. It was not hope. It was older than hope. It was a will to endure for no other reason than that her daughter still breathed somewhere beneath the same sky. She turned from the cathedral, the snow crunching beneath her feet, and made her way back toward the tannery, back toward the alleyways and the coal fires and the hunger. But now, each step echoed with new clarity. The world might have taken everything, but it had not erased her. She would remain. She would witness. She would carry the memory of Leora forward, through snow and silence, and every cruel season still to come. The snow lingered long past midwinter, clinging to the rooftops and curling against the base of buildings like the stubborn ghost of season unwilling to release its grip. In the narrow alleyways behind the tannery, it froze into crusted drifts darkened by soot and foot traffic, and the streets rang with the sharp sound of slipping boots and cartwheels grating over ice. Morel walked with caution now, her balance uncertain from hunger, her knees aching with each descent down the crooked staircase that led from her attic room into the world. The days had blurred into one another, and her body moved more from memory than from will. There was a sense of floating through her own life, as if she had become a figure only half tethered to the ground, present in form but removed from meaning. The hunger, constant now, had changed in texture. It no longer felt like emptiness. It had become a dense pressure, a hollowness so heavy it pulled her inward, collapsing her into herself. There were days she could not remember the taste of bread. Her hands trembled at the tannery bench, the needles slipping more often, the leather taut beneath her fingers. The overseer began to watch her with narrowed eyes, his tolerance fraying alongside his profits. The other women did not speak, but they looked away when she passed. Morel knew what they saw. Someone slipping under. Someone too close to the edge. No one reached out. They were all walking the same narrow line, and one stumble could drag them down as well. It was in this deep winter, during a week of wind so sharp it carved frost into the window glass, that the dreams began to return. Not the soft, blurred visions of memory that haunted her in earlier months, but vivid, searing dreams that dragged her backward into her own childhood, into the long dirt path that led to her father's farm, into the sound of chickens scratching the dust and the smell of wheat silos fermenting in the heat. She saw her father as he had been when she was still a girl, not yet broken by debt, not yet destroyed by drink, but already tired, always tired. His hands were massive, brown and blistered, forever smelling of soil and sweat and hay, and he used them roughly, even when he meant to be kind. He was a man who spoke in commands, not questions, and when he laughed it sounded like bark splitting in the fire. In the dreams, she stood in the corner of the barn as he argued with a man from a mill, his voice rising with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to bargain with. She remembered the shame in that sound, the way it cracked something in her even as a child. Later, when the visitors left, he would sit on the back step of the farmhouse, holding his head in his hands, silent, while the sun bled out over the fields. Morel remembered standing beside him once, barefoot in the grass, too young to understand the words, but old enough to feel the weight. He had looked at her then, eyes red, and said only, "You'll have to be harder than me. This world doesn't wait for softness." She hadn't understood what that meant. Not then, but now, in the chill silence of her attic, she heard those words echo with bitter clarity. After the dreams, she woke with her jaw clenched and her fingernails bitten to the quick. She could no longer remember the last time she had spoken aloud. Days passed in quiet repetition, work, cold, dark. The world narrowed into tunnels. The one from her bed to the pump in the courtyard. The one from the tannery to the refuse pile. The one from her hunger to the ache beneath her ribs. One morning, the overseer shouted at her for a missed stitch, and she simply blinked at him, unable to summon the energy to defend herself. Her thoughts had become scattered, caught in fragments of memory and fear and longing that twisted through her like smoke. She needed something to hold on to, something outside herself. And that was when she began to write. She stole the parchment, if it could even be called theft, scraps discarded from packaging, torn pieces of shipping orders, the backside of tannery invoices smudged with ink. She found a stub of graphite in the seam of a work table and sharpened it against the edge of a window pane. In the hours after her shift, too tired to sleep and too starved to think, she began to draft letters. She did not know to whom they were addressed, not at first. She simply wrote what pressed against her chest, what filled the silence when her stomach groaned and her hands shook. She wrote to the child she had carried, to the life she had once dreamed of, to anyone who might still believe she had worth. She wrote slowly, her script clumsy at first, then steadier. My name is Morel. I gave my daughter to the registry on the first frost of winter. I had no coin left. I had no milk. I have not heard her cry since that day. Then again, my daughter's name is Leora. I named her for light, for the dawn I hope would follow my grief. I do not seek charity. I seek only to know she is alive. And again, if there is a window where she sleeps, please light a candle one night. I will see it. I will believe it means she dreams in peace. She wrote until her fingers cramped. She folded the pages, kissed them once without knowing why, and slid them beneath the threshold of the cathedral, between the stones of the palace wall, into the cracks of the orphanage gate. She knew it was foolish. She knew no one would read them, but the act itself gave her something like breath. It was not hope, not yet. It was a defiance of silence, a declaration that she had not disappeared. The weeks that followed were harder still. The tannery owner fell behind on payments to his suppliers and docked their wages further. The landlord stopped knocking and simply posted notice. Any debt unpaid by the month's end result in eviction. Morel sold the last item of value she owned. A wooden comb inlaid with a blue stone Thane had carved for her during their courtship. It fetched less than a cup of barley, but she held it in her hand for a long time before parting with it. The memory of his calloused fingers shaping something so delicate almost more than she could bear. And still, she wrote, each letter more fragile than the last, each word carved from the thinnest edge of belief. She began to sign her full name at the bottom, then add the words formerly of Hallow Ridge, as if naming the place might root her more firmly in the world, might convince someone, somewhere, that she had once belonged. She wrote by candlelight, though her candles burned low, and sometimes she used a warm edge of her breath to keep the ink from cracking in the cold. Then one evening, while slipping a letter through the slats of the cathedral gate, she heard a voice behind her, soft, uncertain. Do you write to the saints? Morel turned slowly. A girl stood there, no more than 15, carrying a basket of kindling and wrapped in a wool shawl far too large for her. Her cheeks were red from wind, her eyes wide with the quiet, cautious hope of someone who had not yet learned how often life breaks its promises. Morel said nothing, but the girl stepped closer. I read one of your letters. The wind carried it into garden. I wasn't supposed to, but she faltered. You said her name was Leora. Morel's mouth opened, but the words would not come. She nodded. Once. The girl hesitated again. I help in the nursery, sometimes. Just cleaning. But I think I saw her. There's a little girl who cries for a woman's voice. Not the nurse's. Something else. She has a quilt, yellow and blue. The girl's voice lowered. I remember because the corner's torn. Then she stepped back, as if afraid of saying too much. I can't promise anything. I am sorry. And she was gone. Morel stood there long after the girl vanished into the snow. Her hands were frozen. Her lips cracked. Her stomach screamed. But for the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her that was not despair. It was not quite joy. It was smaller than that, a fragile ember in a wind-blown hearth. But it burned. It burned. It said she is alive. She remembers. And Morel, hollowed as she was, held that ember close, knowing it might be all she had, and that it was enough to keep walking through the cold. The snow in the upper district melted faster than anywhere else in Arendelle. There, in the high courtyards of the palace, where the paving stones were laid in patterned granite and kept swept by boys in fur-lined boots, the ice surrendered each morning beneath the breath of coal-fed braziers, and steaming copper kettles hauled from the kitchen cellars before dawn. The gardens, even in winter, were shaped by hands that never chapped, and the bare branches of the fruit trees were brushed clean of frost with feathered brooms, not because it was necessary, but because beauty was treated as duty here, as a matter of governance. The palace itself stood like a sunlit monolith against the pale morning sky, its spires piercing the low clouds and casting shadows like arrows over the city's poorer half, though the people below rarely looked up anymore. What lived behind those walls no longer felt like kin to them, but within the warmth of its central wing, the king walked barefoot across his mother's old rooms, hands folded behind his back, listening to silence. He had only recently taken the throne, but the weight of the crown already pressed into him like frost into stone. It wasn't the ceremonies or the endless petitions that wore him thin. It was the quiet moments in between, the vast and echoing stillness that followed after the doors closed and the guards withdrew. That was when he heard her absence most clearly. His mother had died the year before, taken by a sudden fever that even the palace surgeons couldn't name. though they used phrases like strain of the lungs and late onset consumption in the hope of sounding wise. But no diagnosis changed the fact that she had passed in one brutal week, her hand slipping from his even as he whispered her name again and again, hoping to anchor her to this side of the veil. He had been 20, then just a boy by the standards of governance, though he had grown into manhood quickly in the months since, pressed forward by the machinery of expectation. There had been no time to mourn. The coronation came 2 weeks later. Mourning robes were stitched into royal ones. The candle at his mother's tomb burned without ceasing. But the world had not paused, not even for grief. He did not speak of her often. There was no point. To the court, his sorrow was a private matter, a detail to be managed discreetly, like a limp or a scar. But when he stood alone in the nursery gallery where he had once slept as a child, the memory of her voice returned him in full, firm, musical, tinged with the lilting cadence of the southern provinces from which he had come. She had not been born noble. She had once told him, during one of those rare nights when the rain kept them both awake, that her own mother had been a laundress. She had been raised in the shadow of the grain hills, where the wind sang to the sheaves and hope was something you kept in your pocket, like a lucky stone, rubbed smooth from worry. "I never thought I'd sleep in a room with golden mirrors," she had said, her hand brushing his curls. "But love," she added, almost as an afterthought, "will place you where pride never could." It was that phrase, love over pride, that returned him now as he stood in the receiving chamber one gray afternoon, a sheaf of reports in one hand and a half-drunk cup of quince tea cooling in the other. His steward, a thin man with ink-stained cuffs and a meticulous manner, was speaking about economic measures, new levies on grain shipments from the coastal baronies, tariffs on imported coal, but the king's attention had drifted. He was watching the orphanage ledger open on the steward's armrest, a column of names copied in careful script. Each one a child surrendered to the care of the state in the past 6 months. He hadn't asked to see it. It had simply been included in the morning stack, out of habit or obligation. But something about the names drew him, soft, desperate things, the kind of names that mothers whisper into skin before letting go. He read one twice. Leora Emmeline. The ink was slightly smudged, as if the scribe's hand had trembled mid-stroke. His eye lingered there, not because he recognized the name, but because of the note scrawled beside it in smaller writing. Swaddled in quilt work, marigold and blue, unusual stitch pattern. It was a sort of detail few bothered to record, but whoever had noted it had done so with care, perhaps because the blanket had seemed too fine for the woman who delivered the child, or perhaps because, in a room full of anonymous arrivals, even one scrap of color stood out. The king leaned forward. "Who writes these notes?" The steward blinked. "The orphanage intake clerks, Your Grace. Occasionally the sisters from St. Brace add detail for record. And this child," the king said, tapping the line with one finger. "Leora, who brought her." The steward adjusted his spectacles and read from a side page. Name given, Morel of Hallow Ridge. Husband deceased. No known family in the city. No formal appeal submitted. The king frowned. "What does it mean, no formal appeal?" "It means she left the child, signed a registry log, and made no further claim or petition for custody or support. She followed the law." And yet, the king hesitated, choosing his words with more weight than usual. And yet she gave her a name. And a quilt. He set down the tea. "Find out if there have been any letters concerning this child. Anonymous ones. Delivered to the gates, or the chapel, or the staff." The steward looked uneasy. "Your Grace, with respect, such correspondence is frequent. The sisters at Brace often receive emotional pleas. Most are discarded. We have no record of names." "Then start a new record," the king said, not harshly but with finality that ended debate. "And gather what you can." Quietly, the steward bowed and left. The king remained seated, staring not at the ledger but at the pale gray light that filtered through the stained glass windows above the hearth. He felt something shift in him. Not pity, not curiosity, but a recognition that defied logic. He had been raised among marble and velvet and gold, but his mother had once belonged to the world beyond those gates. And he, for all his power, knew what it meant to love someone too much to let them see your pain. If the mother of this child had been writing, had been walking the streets in the dead of winter to leave scraps of hope at chapel doors. Then she had not moved on. She had not forgotten. That night, while the rest of the court dined on roast pheasant and candy quince beneath the chandelier dome of the East Hall, the king asked to take his meal in the nursery wing. It was a strange request, and the kitchen staff scrambled to accommodate, unsure if it was meant as punishment or privacy. But he did not eat. Instead, he walked the corridors slowly, pausing outside the quiet room where the youngest children were kept. Through the cracked door, he could see the rows of cradles, the nurses moving softly among them. One of the children had begun to cry, a low, hiccuping sound. A woman lifted her, rocking her gently. The quilt around the child's legs was unmistakable, yellow and blue, with one edge pulled and fraying, the seam thick from clumsy but loving stitches. The king did not enter. He simply stood there, watching, something ancient and tender rising behind his ribs. He thought again of his mother, of the way she had cupped his face once after a nightmare and whispered, "Even the smallest voice deserves an answer." He stepped back into the shadowed hall and turned away, his mind already working, not as a king, but as a son who understood what it meant to be born into love that had cost someone everything. By morning, the inquiries had begun, quiet ones, letters dispatched to the parish record keepers of Hallow Ridge, a clerk sent to St. Brace under the guise of routine census work, a quiet notice delivered to the steward of coin, requesting a sealed review of debts held by citizens formerly registered as Morel. The king asked no more questions aloud, but in his silence, something sacred had been set in motion. Not law, not justice, something deeper, something that might, if allowed, grow toward grace. The notice came nailed to her door, driven in with a rusted nail so deep that she had to pry it free with her bare hands. It was thick parchment, sealed with red wax that had run crooked, the ink scrawled in a hand unfamiliar and unforgiving. She had known it would come eventually. For weeks now, she had lived as one lives before a storm. Not in denial, but in a suspended stillness, each breath weighed by the inevitability of collapse. The landlord had stopped speaking to her days ago, not out of cruelty but out of certainty. Her rent was months behind. There were no more belongings to pawn, no trinkets to offer in exchange for time. The comb was gone, the shawl, the buttons from her boots, the tin cup she had once shared with her husband. Her world had become narrowed down to a single cracked bowl, a mattress filled with straw that had long since soured with damp, and a soul that refused, somehow, to extinguish. The letter did not threaten. It stated, by the week's end, she was to vacate the premises. The attic room was to be reclaimed and resold to a new tenant, a younger man from the dye yards, with coin in his pocket and no child in his past to complicate the smell of sweat and sorrow that lingered in the floorboards. Morel read the words once, then folded the parchment and set it on the sill beside the broken lamp, where the wind might carry it away. She did not cry. There was no indulgence left in her for crying. The grief had calcified into something harder, something beyond words. She sat on the edge of her straw pallet, her hands in her lap, and stared at the patch of ceiling where a spider moved slowly along the beam, its fragile legs navigating the web. She had once watched it spin in the glow of candlelight. She had grown accustomed to the spider. It did not leave her. It did not ask for anything. By the following evening, the snow had turned to sleet again, and the city wore its hunger openly. The market stalls were fewer. The streets held a hush not born of reverence but fatigue. Morel stepped out into the wet dark with the parchment folded in her pocket, and the last of her strength cinched around her waist like a belt. She did not know where she was going, only that she could no longer remain where she had been. Each footstep sent icy water through her boot soles, soaking the threadbare socks that clung to her ankles. Her hands ached from cold, but she refused to hide them in her sleeves. She needed to feel the air, needed to be certain she still could. The cathedral steps were slick with melting ice, the stone worn smooth by centuries of genuflections and pleas. She climbed them slowly, her breath shallow and loud in her own ears. No one paid her any mind. A beggar in the shadow of the altar was no more rare than a stain in the corner of a tapestry. But Morel did not sit. She did not beg. She made her way to the base of the statue of Saint Dolorosa and knelt, not out of devotion, but from the failure of her legs to hold her. The saint looked down with her eternally mournful eyes, one hand open, the other resting against her chest. It was said that Dolorosa had once carried her dying son for 12 miles through snow, that her feet had bled through her shoes, and that she had spoken not one word the entire journey. Morel believed this, not as legend, as memory, as kinship. The receipt was still in her pocket. She had unfolded it so many times that the crease had split, the ink smudged and blurred, the stamp of the registry barely legible. She held it now between her palms like a sacrament. This was the only proof that Leora had ever been hers, not the birth scar that had long since healed, not the dream-laden milk that had dried from her breast in the dark. This scrap of paper, cold, indifferent, bearing no trace of the child's scent or laughter, was all she had. She pressed it to her lips, then held it up to the stone hand of the saint, as if to offer it into some divine archive. A wind rose through the courtyard and tugged at the corners of the parchment. She did not fight it. Her fingers opened, and the paper lifted into the air, weightless and wild. It fluttered once, twice, then sailed down the cathedral steps like a lost leaf, spinning into the dusk and vanishing into the city. She watched it go, her mouth slack, her eyes wide. It felt absurdly like letting go of Leora all over again, but this time without ceremony, without the witnessing of ink or midwives or stone-cloaked officials. This time it was just her and the wind and the ghost of what she had carried. The ache that rose in her then was not just grief. It was fury. She stood, swaying, her arms trembling from cold and hunger and the sudden throb of something dangerously close to rebellion. The world had taken everything. Her home, her child, her name, and yet she was still here. Her body still breathed. Her heart still beat. Her eyes still searched the shadows for the shape of her daughter's face. And in that terrible, beautiful moment, Morel realized that survival alone was no longer enough. She had not lived through frost and loss and starvation, only to vanish like a debt erased from a ledger. She was not a figure to be tidied away. She was a mother. Still, she left the cathedral without speaking, her steps slow but steady. The night was thick now, snow falling in wide, wet flakes that clung to her shoulders like small, pitying hands. She walked without a destination, the streets unfamiliar in their quiet. Somewhere a bell rang the hour, though she did not count. She passed shuttered shops, their signs swinging weakly in the wind, and crossed the empty bridge that divided the city's east and west districts. The river below churned with meltwater and ash, but she did not pause. Her body moved from instinct, from a hunger deeper than food. She found herself near the orphanage gates without remembering how she had gotten there. The great iron archway of St. Brace loomed above her, its torches unlit, its doors bolted for the night. She stared at it, her breath fogging the air, and felt the slow burn of something awakening in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but will, the sheer, desperate will to be seen, to be known, to be more than the woman who had vanished behind a signature. In the snow, she knelt again, this time not in reverence, but in declaration. With her fingers, she began to write in the powder her daughter's name, over and over, the letters shaky but clear. Leora, Leora, Leora. 100 times, if she had to, she whispered it into the cold, into the wind, into the brick and stone of the wall that separated her from what she had once held. She wanted the very earth to remember. Then, slowly, she unwrapped her scarf and laid it in the snow beneath the gate, a gesture of offering, of protest, of proof. It was her last possession, a faded scrap of wool once given by Thane before his lungs turned to liquid. She had worn it every day since his death, and now she left it here as a mark, a line drawn in the frost. If they would not hear her letters, they would see her silence. She remained until her body could no longer hold its weight. Her limbs began to spasm from the cold, and still she lingered, unwilling to retreat. Only when the sky turned the pale blue of pre-dawn did she rise. Her feet were stiff, her knees stiffened with ice. She did not look back as she left, though the shape of the scarf against the snow imprinted itself on her memory like a wound. By the time she returned to the tannery quarter, the city had begun to stir. Carts moved through the streets with squeaking wheels. Chimneys belched smoke. Doors opened to spill out boys with bread trays and women with broomsticks. Morel walked unnoticed through it all, a figure in rags with snow in her hair and a heart split wide open. She climbed the stairs to her attic one final time and sat on the edge of the mattress, her breath curling around her like fog. She did not sleep. She waited, because something had shifted, not the world, but herself, and that, she knew now, was where change always began. The morning came quiet, not with the usual muttering of carts and chimneys and street boys calling bread weights down the row, but with a stillness that made the city feel paused, as if Arendelle itself had held its breath. Snow had fallen again during the night, fine and dry, covering the soot-grimed cobbles with a fragile veil. The sky above the tannery was the soft gray of unspoken thoughts. In the attic room, Morel sat awake, not because the cold had woken her or hunger had stirred her stomach, but because something inside her had turned restless in the dark. She had not slept since returning from the orphanage gate. Her body was sore and rimmed with frostbitten tremors, but her mind had burned all night with a singular fire, a quiet certainty that could not be named. There was no reason for it, no signs, no voices, only the weight of having finally laid herself bare before the gate, and the strange, terrible peace that had followed. She rose without ceremony. There was nothing left to pack. The room held only emptiness and the stale scent of cold ashes in the hearth. She smoothed the bedding with a trembling hand, out of habit more than pride, and descended the stairs one last time. The stairwell was damp, the banister warped from years of heat and mold in careless hands. Her steps barely made a sound. Outside, the street was uncharacteristically silent. The tannery yard lay empty. No bell rang, no steamed, and for a moment Morel wondered if the world had finally ended in the night, not with fire, but with frost. Then she saw the figures. At the end of the lane stood a small group. Two well-dressed belonged to Shoemaker's Row, their cloaks dusted with snow, their boots high and shining. There was no fanfare, no horns or flags, just a quiet presence of people who did not belong in these parts. A man stood at the front, tall and wrapped in a black coat trimmed with pale fur, his posture, too, refined to be anything but noble. Behind him, two attendants stood bearing covered bundles, and a third figure, smaller, cloaked entirely in gray, stood silently, a few paces back, as if uncertain of their purpose. Morel stopped in her tracks. Her throat tightened. She knew instinctively that they had come for her, but she could not move, could not breathe. Her feet had rooted to the ground as if they feared what would follow movement. One of the attendants stepped forward and cleared his throat politely, as if asking to borrow sugar. Morel of Hallow Ridge? She nodded. The tall man stepped forward. His voice was low and careful, as if approaching a bird that might flee. By decree of his grace, King Allard of Arendelle, we come a word of justice and restitution. The word struck her as surreal, like something overheard in a dream. She did not understand them at first, not truly. Justice and restitution were terms for courtrooms, for nobles, for townspeople who still live within the safety of law, not for women like her, not for women whose names were barely remembered by their own landlords. She opened her mouth to speak, but the man continued gently. Your debts are forgiven, effective this morning. An official writ has been delivered to the ledger hall and signed by the crown seal. You are no longer a tenant here. Your presence is under royal protection. He nodded toward the third figure, who now stepped forward, the gray cloak shifting in the breeze. A small hand emerged from the folds of the cloth, pale and familiar, and the breath caught in Morel's throat so suddenly she staggered. The hood fell back. The world stopped. Leora, it was her, standing, awake, holding the hand of the nursemaid who had once disappeared behind silk banners and stone gates. The child blinked up at her, uncertain. Her hair had grown. Her cheeks were rounder, her limbs stronger, but the eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes that had met Morel's in those quiet hours after birth, when the room was still and filled with the scent of milk and wool and fear. Morel dropped to her knees before her body even registered emotion. Her arms trembled, then reached, then stopped midair, as if afraid to ask for more than sight. Leora took one step forward, then another. Mama, she said, voice tentative, shaped around a word she should not have remembered. Could not have remembered. Morel wept without sound. Her hands, callous and cracked and dirt-stained, pressed against her chest as if to keep her ribs from breaking apart. She nodded, over and over, unable to speak, unable to believe. The child moved into her arms slowly, with the instinctive hesitation of someone who knew touch could both soothe and vanish. But once there, once skin met skin, something ancient and holy rippled through Morel's bones. She clutched her daughter close, breathing in her scent, her warmth, her weight, as if trying to memorize every piece of her all over again. I thought... She choked out, the words collapsing before they fully formed. I didn't think, I didn't know. The nursemaid knelt beside them and placed a soft hand on Morel's back. She never forgot you. Not once. She cried for you in her sleep. The woman's voice trembled. We were instructed to document her habits. She would not let go of the quilt. Morel looked down and saw it, threadbare and faded but unmistakable, wrapped around Leora's shoulders like a banner of survival. Her stitches, her hands, her offering. She touched the edge of it reverently, then kissed the child's fingers, her brow, her cheek. The man in the black coat waited in silence until she rose. When she did, he handed her a folded parchment, sealed with the royal crest. There's a decree inside, he said. Your name has been restored to the census. Your record with the foundling registry has been amended. Your daughter is under your care, fully. The king has instructed us to see that you are relocated immediately to a home of safety. I don't understand, she whispered. You wrote, he said simply. You left letters. At the gate, at the chapel. He read them. Morel stared at him, overwhelmed. The king, the man gave a small smile. He said to tell you, no crown should weigh more than a mother's arms. The phrase shattered something inside her, shame, disbelief, silence. All her long nights of aching, the hunger, the kneeling, the frostbitten letters folded like prayers, the cathedral steps, the scarf. It had not vanished into the void. It had traveled. It had arrived. And so had he. They walked together back through the alley, the three attendants moving with quiet deference, one carrying the small bundle of food and clean garments they had brought for her. Morel did not ask where they were going. She did not care. It was enough that her daughter's hand was in hers, that the weight of loss had shifted at last into the weight of belonging. They passed neighbors who stared openly, mouths agape, and she did not flinch. She walked taller than she had in years. The wind no longer bit at her face. It lifted the edge of her sleeve like a blessing. That evening, they were taken to a small cottage just beyond the palace gardens, nestled near a grove of ash trees, and a shallow brook that murmured through the stone. It was modest but clean, warm, with a hearth already lit and a wooden crib beside the bed. The steward who led them inside left with a nod and did not linger. Morel stood in the center of the room, holding her daughter's hand, and let herself breathe for the first time in months. Not shallow, not stunted, a real breath, deep and slow. Leora sat on the floor and began to hum, a tune Morel had not heard since Hallow Ridge, something half remembered from the lullabies her own mother had once sung. Morel knelt beside her, brushed a curl from her brow, and kissed her gently. Then she lit a candle, not as prayer, not as plea, but as a promise. She placed in the window, where it would burn through the night, a small, steady flame, a witness to return, a monument to endurance, a light that would never again be left in the cold. The spring thaw came slowly, not as a sudden breaking, but as a quiet loosening, ice turning to water with a sigh, snow receding from the corners of rooftops, windows cracking open just wide enough to let in the scent of damp earth. In the mornings, birds began to return to the edges of the grove beyond the cottage, their calls hesitant at first, as if unsure they were welcome after such a long silence. Morel would wake to their song and lie still for a while, listening, her daughter curled against her side, one small arm draped across her ribs. It was not a home she had ever imagined, this little croft on the edge of the royal district, built of timber and stone, set beside a brook that murmured through reeds and low bramble. It bore no resemblance to the house she had shared with Thane in Hallow Ridge, nor to the narrow attic where sorrow had once hollowed her. but it was home in the truest sense now, not for its walls, but for who it held. There was a rhythm to life here, gentler than anything she had known since girlhood. Each morning she rose early, before the child stirred, to kindle a hearth and boil water from the spring-fed pump outside. The air was still cold enough to make her fingers ache, but the light had changed, brighter now, more golden, seeping through the shutters in long stripes that fell across the floor like blessings. She would steep wild herbs in the kettle, mint and sweet thistle when she could get them from the garden, and then kneel to stir the porridge, adding whatever she had, oats, grated apple, a spoonful of honey. When Leora woke, she would sit cross-legged on the bench beside the hearth and eat slowly, humming to herself, her fingers drumming little patterns on the wood. She had learned quickly how to make herself at home and quiet. In the afternoons, they worked the soil together. The king's men had brought them seed, barley mostly, and a few small bulbs of garlic and leek. The garden plot behind the cottage had been in use for several seasons, its furrows grown shallow, its fences splintered, but Morel had spent long hours turning it over with a rusted spade, her hands blistered and raw, the labor anchoring her body to a kind of joy that surprised her. Leora loved to dig, even when her rows were crooked, and often talked to the earth in her soft, dreamlike way, asking the worms where they slept or telling the beetles to be careful where they walked. Morel would watch her and remember the old stories her grandmother had told, the ones where the spirits of the field listened best to children's voices. She did not speak those things aloud. Some beliefs were better held like warmth in the chest, never spilled. On market days, Morel walked with Leora into the town center, where the flower carts returned and the streets no longer bore the smell of frost and desperation. People still recognized her, though now they stared differently. Some with wonder, some with unease, some with the cautious kindness that came when the lowly were lifted too high. A few even bowed their heads, not deeply, but just enough to acknowledge what she had become, a figure touched by grace, if only briefly. She did not linger in the center square. She preferred the smaller stalls on the south side, where women sold baked root pies and jars of sweet vinegar, where the flour merchants still weighed by hand, and the cobblers told stories while hammering saws. She was remembered there, too, not as a miracle, but as a woman who had once bought nothing and still thanked them for the chance to look. She carried her coins in a tin box now, wages sent monthly from the royal steward, not grand, but enough. Her debts, once recorded in thick ink on landlord ledgers and tannery books, had been wiped clean by decree. She had seen the scrolls herself, though she never touched them, uneasy around the permanence of such wealth. It was not coin she had longed for in those dark months. It had been this: safety, the absence of fear, the knowledge that her daughter would sleep with full belly and wake without needing to count how many days she could go without bread. Leora thrived in this new life. She was still quiet, still given to long silences and sudden questions that caught Morel off guard, but her color had returned, her limbs strong, her laughter unguarded. Some nights she would climb into Morel's bed without a word, curl against her side, and say only, "You didn't go." And Morel would hold her and reply, "Never again," because promises made to children mattered more than vows spoken before altars. She told Leora stories now, real ones, not fairy tales. Of Thane's kindness, his slow laughter, how he used to carve figures from softwood and place them along the windowsill for her. She spoke of her own mother, who had walked barefoot through fields in the rain, and of the village where life had once been small enough to hold in one hand. She told the truth, not all at once, but in pieces, in the spaces between planting and sleep. Letters came sometimes, too, not often, but enough to remind her that the world beyond the cottage had not forgotten. The steward would deliver them, folded neatly and sealed in the same dark wax. Once, there had been a small wooden horse tucked inside, carved by a palace artisan and painted with care. Leora had loved it instantly. Morel had wept when she was alone, not for the object, but for the gesture. It had not been a gift. It had been a listening. There was no word of the king himself. He did not visit. He did not send messages. But Morel felt his presence in other ways, in the care with which the grain sacks were measured, in the way no tax collectors came to the door, in the quiet protection that blanketed the cottage like mist. It was not intimacy, but it was something truer than obligation. She knew, without ever being told, that he had once loved someone who had walked barefoot through a storm. 2. The seasons began to shift again. Buds formed on the trees. The river, once sluggish and brown with melt, turned green and alive. Birds built nests in the eaves. The barley shot up in thin, green stalks. Morel knelt in the garden one evening, her hands deep in the soil, and felt a sudden shiver move through her, not of cold, but of understanding. She had survived. She had become the thing she had once thought lost. A mother not broken by loss, but remade by it. At night, after Leora had fallen asleep, Morel would light a single candle and sit by the window, watching its flame flicker against the pane. She no longer wept when she saw it. She no longer felt the ache of the nights she had spent without her child. Instead, she felt a quiet gratitude for the soil beneath her nails, for the breath of her daughter on her shoulder, for the silence that no longer meant emptiness, but peace. She had no illusions. The world was still a place that bent mothers until they broke. It still punished the poor for the crime of needing. But here, in this small life carved from mercy and will, she had found something beyond survival. She had found a way to belong, not to the city or the court or the crown, but to the earth, to her child, to the quiet promise she made every time she planted a seed or wiped a cheek or pressed her lips to the small, sleeping brow beside her in the dark. Leora would grow. She would ask more questions. She would learn the way to the world in her own time. But for now, she danced barefoot in the garden and asked the bees their names. And Morel answered her with the voice of someone who had walked through every season of loss and come out the other side, not untouched, but whole in the only way that mattered. The candle burned low. Outside, the wind stirred the barley in the fields, and the night smelled of rain and new roots. Morel closed her eyes and whispered a single word into the silence. Home. Summer came in slow crescendos, the long days gilded with a warmth that soaked into the soil, the barley rising with steady hunger. Each stalk a testament to time and quiet tending. The cottage breathed in rhythm with the land now, its stones warmed by midday, its eaves shaded in honeyed gold by the setting sun. Insects hummed like soft percussion through the late afternoons, and the brook beside the garden narrowed into a babbling trickle, more song than river, tracing silver threads through the roots of the ash trees. Morel moved with ease in these weeks, her gait strong, her face bronzed not with youth, but with something deeper, renewal perhaps, or the slow, harder and grace of one who had endured every season the world could offer and found herself still whole in the end. Leora was nearly 4 now, her body growing like the garden she loved so fiercely. Her voice had taken on the confidence of someone who knew her place in the world, who had been returned, chosen, held. Each morning she woke with stories pouring from her lips, dreams about dancing moths, talking seeds, cloud spirits who floated down to whisper riddles before dawn. Morel let her speak and listen without correcting. Language, she believed now, was not only for clarity. It was for belonging, for creation, for casting spells against forgetfulness. She herself had once nearly vanished beneath silence. She would not allow her daughter to grow up believing her words were anything less than sacred. The barley was ready for harvest before the first week of August ended. The heads bowed low with weight, and Morel could feel the tug in her palms even before she touched them. She sharpened the sickle herself, recalling the exact angle of her father's hands all those years ago when he'd shown her how to edge the blade with a whetstone, how to listen for the pitch that meant readiness. She worked with sleeves rolled high, her knees in the dirt, the sweat of labor dripping from her brow and chin. But the work did not exhaust her. It restored. It reminded her what it meant to be tethered to something living, something real. She tied the barley in bundles with Leora helping beside her, the child too small to carry much but determined to try. "I'm strong, Mama," she'd say with every stalk she dragged, her little hands red from the rope. "I'm strong like the trees." Morel smiled and kissed the crown of her head, sticky with sunlight and dust. "You're stronger," she replied, voice low with the truth of it. "You grew through winter." After the field was cleared, Morel stood beside the stacked sheaves and looked out across the cottage yard, the sky wide and open above her. She had no reason to look toward the city anymore. She had not walked the court road in months. There had been no summons, no new letters from palace. She suspected that the king had chosen, deliberately, to leave her life uninterrupted, and she was grateful for it. Gratitude, she had learned, was not about obligation. It was about recognition. He had given her a new beginning, and then stepped away, allowing her to make of it something real. She had expected, at first, some gesture continuation, some symbolic visit, but what she received instead was something far rarer: privacy, sovereignty, peace. The townspeople still spoke of her sometimes, but with a quiet reverence they reserved for the half-mythical. Children pointed when she passed. Vendors offered her the freshest apples without asking payment. A woman who had once turned her away from a bakery in midwinter now crossed the road just to place a hand on Morel's shoulder and say, simply, "I'm glad you endured." Morel had no appetite for glory. She did not need to be remembered in their songs or stitched into their saints' banners. But she was not invisible anymore, and that, to her, was enough. She kept the stamp receipt tucked between the pages of her mother's old psalm book. The parchment now softened to near transparency. The ink faded but still legible. On certain nights, when the wind whistled just so and the ache of old memory returned like a bruise touched too many times, she would sit by the candle and unfold it, tracing the lines with her finger, not out of grief, but out of reverence. That piece of paper had once been the only proof of her love. It had been all she had. And now, though she no longer needed it to claim her daughter, she kept it as a vow, a testimony, not to pain, but to presence. Autumn crept into corners of their days. The leaves of the ash trees shifted from deep green to ochre and rust, and the sky took on that early dusk hue that always felt like a whisper to rest. Morel prepared the cottage for the colder months, patching the thatch, lining the windows, collecting the dried bundles of thyme, marjoram, and sage from the rafters. Leora helped her tie herbs into sachets, her little fingers nimble now, quick to learn. They strung them on twine and hung them near the hearth, where they would smoke sweetly through the winter and remind them of growing things. One evening, as the first chill rolled down from the hills, they sat by the fire with the shutters closed and the candle lit. Leora half asleep against Morel's shoulder. The child stirred and murmured, "Tell me the story again, Mama, the one with the letter in the snow." Morel smiled. "The one with the scarf in the gate?" Leora nodded sleepily, her breath warm against her neck. And so Morel told it, not in the same words each time, but always with the same heart. She told of the woman who had walked through winter with nothing, who had laid her last possession on the ground and spoken her child's name into the cold. She told of the candle, of the letter that flew away like a leaf, of the voice that said, "Even the smallest voice deserves an answer." She never said her own name aloud in the story. She let it belong to the wind, to the night, to the silence. Leora, in time, would understand, not just the story, but the shape of what had been saved, the cost of return, the work of staying. But for now, it was enough that she listened, that she knew her name had once been carried through storm and stone and fire to reach her again. That night, after Leora had gone to bed, Morel stepped outside and stood in the garden, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The sky above was clear and thick with stars, the kind of sky her mother used to call honest. Bare clouds bared deceit. She lit a small lantern and hung it on the post by the garden gate. A single light, not as a signal, not as a plea, but as a mark of presence, of witness, of a life remade. She stood there a long while, breathing the sharpness of the coming frost, her eyes closed, her pulse steady. Everything she had feared had come to pass. And still she had endured, not alone, not untouched, but unchanged in the way that mattered most. The next day, travelers passed the cottage and paused at the gate, drawn by the scent of drying herbs and the soft curve of the barley rose. One asked in a quiet voice if this was a place where the child had been returned, where the debts had been erased, where a woman once laid a scarf in the snow and had it answered by a crown. Morel did not confirm. She only smiled gently and offered them warm tea and a seat beneath the arbor. If they stayed, she let them rest. If they asked again, she gave them bread and said, "There are better stories in the earth than in the ears." But the story remained, not in the mouths of merchants or the ink of scribes, but in the life Morel lived each day, in the way she walked the fields, in the way her daughter laughed, in the barley that bent its head when the wind passed through, in the candle that burned still every night. Because legacy is not always carved in stone. Sometimes it is grown, sometimes it is chosen, and sometimes it is a quiet light in the window of a house where love, once lost, has returned home to stay.